Regulate Web3 Apps, Not Protocols Part 2. Summary. Framework for regulating Web3 apps. This blog series, titled Regulate Web3 Apps, Not Protocols, delves into the development of a Web3 regulatory framework that aims to preserve the advantages of Web3 technology, protect the future of the Internet, and minimize the risks associated with illicit activities and consumer harm. The central principle of this framework is to regulate businesses instead of decentralized, autonomous software. The blog highlights two extreme positions on Web3 regulation, one that advocates for the total expansion and application of existing regulations to Web3, and another that argues for the complete exclusion of Web3 from current regulations. The author contends that both of these positions are problematic and result in poor policy outcomes. The proposed approach is to regulate businesses rather than software, focusing on apps instead of protocols, which has historically benefited the public interest during the Internet's growth. The Web3 app regulatory framework should concentrate on three interrelated factors: policy objectives, characteristics of the apps to be regulated, and the constitutional implications of specific regulations. The blog emphasizes that policy objectives for Web3 app regulation should take into account the underlying purposes of existing regulations, and evaluate if these purposes apply to Web3 apps, given their distinct functionality and risk profiles. The characteristics of the apps should directly influence the scope of regulation, while the constitutional implications should be scrutinized through a granular, fact-based approach. Decentralization, a primary advantage of blockchain technology, has substantial regulatory implications. The blog distinguishes between centralized finance, CFI, and decentralized finance, DeFi, noting that while CFI regulations aim to reduce risks associated with trusting intermediaries, DeFi's decentralization, transparency, and trustlessness largely eliminate these risks. As a result, applying CFI regulations to DeFi may not always be reasonable or effective. The blog further emphasizes that regulations should have a clear and relevant purpose, appropriate scope, and productive effect. It underscores the importance of understanding DeFi at a granular level to avoid superficial naming homologies that obscure the actual differences between traditional finance and blockchain finance. In conclusion, the blog advocates for a pragmatic approach to Web3 app regulation that concentrates on businesses rather than software protocols. This method should take into account policy objectives, app characteristics, and constitutional implications to establish a regulatory framework that preserves the benefits of Web3 technology, while mitigating risks and safeguarding consumers. The blog post also discusses Web3 app characteristics and their potential regulatory implications, highlighting two key characteristics that impact regulation: whether the app is operated by a business for profit and whether the app's primary purpose is to facilitate regulated activities. For-profit Web3 apps may require more regulation due to potential risks like conflicts of interest. However, the blog argues that a flexible regulatory approach may be justified for these apps to promote growth and development. Conversely, Web3 apps not operated for profit, often serving as public goods, may not present the same concerns and should be subject to less stringent regulation. The blog post further addresses the constitutional implications of Web3 regulation, raising questions about the First Amendment's protection of code as speech, the Fourth Amendment's potential protection against unreasonable searches and seizures, and the need for multi-agency cooperation to ensure compliance with constitutional norms. The blog concludes that effective Web3 regulation necessitates a reassessment of existing regulatory schemes, a deep understanding of Web3 technology, and a delicate balancing of policy objectives. Clear policy objectives should be established, emphasizing risk reduction of illicit activities without hindering innovation. The blog calls for open, respectful dialogue among policymakers, regulators, and Web3 participants to cultivate an environment that encourages innovation while limiting the creation of unnecessary gatekeepers. In summary, the blog examines Web3 app characteristics, potential regulatory implications, and constitutional concerns surrounding Web3 regulation. It stresses the need for a balanced approach to regulation that considers the unique aspects of Web3 technology and fosters innovation. Content type: article, blog post. Content Publisher, A16Z Crypto, Miles Jennings and Brian Quintenz. Publish date, January 2023.